It's a long-touted idea that the free market is the best method of distributing goods at the lowest cost possible in existence. At one point in time, that was actually true. Back when nothing was automated and governments were much more inefficient, that was absolutely true. However, as time has progressed, that argument has begun to ring more and more hollow. Thanks to certain factors, government has been shown time and time again to be the best at providing the basic needs for everyone to succeed and live happy, productive lives. There still is a place for the free market, but for choices, luxuries, and scarce items. Basic goods and services are no longer scarce or a luxury, and are now costing us all way more than if they were provided by the government. This is true for several reasons. First is the concepts of economies of scale. The larger an organization gets and customer base gets, the cheaper and cheaper overhead gets. Nothing is larger in a nation than the entire nation, so no business can and will ever reach this tiny level of overhead. The second reason is that there is no profit motive for government. A government has all the advantages of a charity with none of the downsides of being a charity. It doesn't have to advertise. It doesn't cannibalize donations from other current charities like what currently happens in the nonprofit sector. And most charities have a massive relative overhead, but with underpaid staff and often overpaid CEOs. The government has a tiny overhead and well-paid employees, which boosts local economy instead of charity workers with weak buying power. With a for-profit company, at least 20% goes to shareholders, and that cost is passed along to the customers. A government does not have to do this at all. The third reason is the ability to give huge lowest bidder contracts. This one is a big factor in why government is cheaper than the free market. Private sector companies trip over themselves to get a government contract for this reason. It's reliable and will set them up with a guaranteed customer they don't have to spend tons of money on marketing down the line. When done right, the competition is so tight that the government gets the best deal possible, just like how the free market is touted as working, but even more efficient as government can afford experts to inspect and make sure that what they're getting is of equal quality as their competitors, as opposed to you who have to make an educated but often poorly educated guess as to who is better. The government has every right to negotiate down prices because they're creating customers that otherwise would not exist and using the taxpayers' money to do it, so they have a duty to get the taxpayers the fairest deal possible. The last reason is transparency. In a company, you have no idea how it's doing, what kind of satisfaction it has, what kind of fail rates it has, how it treats its workers, where it sources its materials. You just have to blindly trust the brand and hope they're being ethical or providing a good product. However, because all government data is required to be public, but private companies aren't required to make theirs public too, people can point out all the natural occurring flaws and inefficiencies all large government organizations have without comparing them to other private industries, so the comparison is always unfair and one-sided, and the government just looks bad. Sheer numbers of wastes are shocking, but if you looked at the percent efficiency of such a large system compared to company waste, they would probably be comparable if not better, and without the profit motive. So let's look at some of the basic needs that would be cheaper if we let the government take care of it, as opposed to the private sector, that are charging us twice as much as they should and making us all poorer. First off is, of course, healthcare or health insurance. Government-run healthcare or insurance is half the price in any other nation than it is in America's free market. From government-run healthcare in Britain and Canada called single-payer to government-run insurance called public option in nations like Germany. People on these plans spend half as much and live longer than Americans who are run on a purely free market system. And yes, Obamacare is purely free market driven. It just requires everyone to buy insurance who can afford it, boosting the pool of risk, or pay a tax to prevent irresponsible people from mooching off the law requiring hospitals to treat anyone in a life or death emergency, which is passed on to insurance-paying customers. It also requires insurance companies to spend at least 80% of their income on patients, which before, more than 20% went to overhead or stock owners. In France, that number is 95%. It also ensures people won't get turned away for pre-existing conditions and eliminates worthless cheap insurance that didn't actually cover anything. The insurance companies, the hospitals, the drug manufacturers, and the medical device manufacturers are all free market, with high overhead and high profit motives. for things people have to survive and can charge essentially what they want for it. And people go bankrupt or die as things like insulin can cost as much as rent, essentially having to pay rent to live in their own body. And hundreds in America have died, and even more have been driven into poverty and bankruptcy for medical costs. It's the equivalent of charging people for air, even though insulin is actually pretty dang cheap to produce, except the market is cornered by unfair patent laws. The government can use two models, and both cost the citizen half of what Americans currently pay. One is single payer, where the people pay higher taxes, and the government covers the cost of your care, sometimes owning the hospitals, and sometimes just getting good deals with the hospitals. And the other is public option, where you will buy your insurance from the government or a competitor if you want the option and feeling of choice, and you can use your insurance with any hospital you like. The government, either way, negotiates prices down, has tiny overhead, has lowest bid contractors, and regulates to ensure that they give what they promise, has complete transparency, and has no profit motive. This literally cuts the price of healthcare in half, and the insurance companies that can compete and offer much lower prices by proxy, since the government has pushed prices down, can still exist. In terms of cost and quality, in the short run, government-run health insurance is the most fiscally responsible option possible. Not to mention that lack of preventable care is ridiculously more expensive with emergency services that could have easily been prevented, or loss in work productivity and increased distractions or accidents at work due to untreated chronic illness or untreated mental health issues that, if fixed, could boost worker productivity significantly. And even if you are healthy and take care of yourself, lack of access to healthcare increases the spread of infectious diseases by a massive rate. And you will just, by basic statistics, end up getting food poisoning because the server or cook can't afford to both take off work and stay at home, but they also can't afford to see a doctor. The purely free market argument for health insurance is no longer viable and is destroying the finances of the American people. Next is education. It costs less to fully educate people than to imprison them, and less lives are destroyed. America now has the highest incarceration rate of any nation on the planet. The full cost of people in prison costs the nation $1 trillion a year. Most European nations incarcerate 1/10 the people we do. Poor education experience costs taxpayers in medical care, emergency care, and increased crime rates, and the cost of imprisonment as poor achievement in education directly correlates with crime rates, as through education you learn impulse control, cost-benefit analysis, and it opens up legal opportunities to wealth and happiness, making the cost of crime not even close to a comparable option. According to a study listed below, the federal government currently pays $69 billion on student aid. States spend $21.8 billion in student aid, and that goes directly to the students, who use that to pay for college. And total student expenditures, including those state grants, are $62.9 billion. A total of $130 billion per year is spent on college. $40 billion comes from students. 25% of eligible college total money is $130 billion. $50 billion is community or junior college. 42% of Americans have this level of education and is essential to moving into the middle class. 2/3 of high school students are now going to some college right out of high school, and half of all high school dropouts, which are between 5 to 15% of students, end up getting their GED and going to at least community college. So if by making college free at the current rate, and we boosted total education to say even 100% of high school or GED students, it would be around $135 billion or $94 billion that students would spend, and that is now spent by the government. This is, of course, ignoring current adults who have to retool when their industry dies, or people who want to go on to higher learning. But I don't have that data. This is a rough estimate. It also doesn't take current prisoners into account who used to be able to get their degree in prison, reducing recidivism, but funds have dried up and their state abandoned the system. Let's pretend very conservatively that, unlike Europe, and we drop our rates to 1/10 incarceration rates through education, we drop it just 10%. That is $100 billion. Free tuition to state schools and community colleges have paid for themselves in long term. This is a little bit of a weak argument, but let's add a few other factors, such as the fact that when the troops returned from World War II, they got to go to college for free through the Montgomery GI Bill. Over the years, that education bumped these troops into higher tax brackets, so the government got more taxes out of them. They were less likely to commit crimes, even with the PTSD, and they had a lot more buying power. The GI Bill not only paid for itself, but made even more so in the long run. There is a reason why nations around the world are not only making college free for their own people, but for foreign people as well, as if they can spread education and their values around the world, there is lower poverty, better relations, and less war, which is also very expensive in the trillions of dollars. American colleges also have an inflation rate exponentially higher than actual inflation. This is because of our student loan system, which was deregulated without negotiating down prices with colleges. Just like with the healthcare industry, in Europe, they create new customers by funding education or healthcare, and because they created artificial customers, they negotiate down the price, as colleges and medical companies now have a lower overhead due to economies of scale. Instead, in the US, the government throws money at people based on cost, and then the education and medical companies raise the price, and the government then raises their pay in a vicious cycle until it's too expensive. Though, in terms of education, it is student loans and pretty much the only way into the middle class unless your grades are perfect in the US, especially with increased automation destroying blue-collar jobs, so now you need at least a 2-year degree to get the same jobs that a high school graduate would have gotten 20 years ago. Add to this that federal and state aid spends a lot on means testing to make sure you qualify for aid, and making college free would eliminate that work, reducing the $40 billion even further. So even if free higher education reduced incarceration by less than 10%, it would more than pay for itself. It is much more likely that it would have even larger benefits that I don't have the data to discuss here, perhaps costing the American people half as much as our current model. Americans who may want to go on and get their masters or PhDs end up avoiding it because they're currently financially burned out and distrusting that their returning to college won't leave them deeper in debt than if they just stick with the education levels they have. So instead, we just poach PhD talent from other countries that pay for it for our rural doctors, researchers, and engineers, creating brain drain in their home countries that really could use their know-how to fix their own problems. This is not to say that we shouldn't let them come here, but we're relying on them instead of our own people for this work. There are some issues with the plan, such as poor students are not having access to books and housing, and the fact that people who don't have to pay for college are less likely to finish and place value on it because they didn't put any skin in the game. Some low level of tuition could be required on a sliding scale to help our poor students, but most of the tuition should be paid for and the price negotiated down to keep college affordable. Mathematically speaking, America will be better and smarter. Next is food. It's now cheaper to feed everyone in America than let people starve. Food is ridiculously cheap and affordable now thanks to government research and subsidies. Pretty much all of that research was done for military use using our money to ensure a steady supply of long-lasting shelf-stable food for the troops. The conservative model is whoever shall not work, neither shall he eat, was a great saying in a mostly agrarian system. But we now live in a creative and service-based industry, and only 2% of Americans are in agriculture, and we create enough food right now to feed the world, but due to the way the government incentivizes and the way market forces are set up, we let so much food rot in the ground it's ridiculous, and we focus most of our farming on corn and soy, which are great in moderation and perfect as a method to stave off famine, but aren't healthy if it's the majority of your food, especially if it's in the form of corn syrup, and it is in the US. Grains, dairy, and meat are heavily subsidized in the US, and vegetables and fruit are considered specialty crops and get almost no subsidies thanks to lobbying and military food policies. Because of this, they pay their pickers pennies on the dollar of what they're worth. Vegetables should make up to half our intake, but lobbying has made the government recommends that whole wheat grain products take up that slice, which usually translates into white flour products. And at this point, thanks to income inequality, 1 in 5 children go to bed hungry in a nation that produces the most food in the world, and that's unacceptable. 40% of American food is wasted and let to rot either in the fridge or in the fields. Thanks to bad labor and immigration laws, our vegetables rot in the fields and don't get picked. And kids going hungry is not just a pain issue, it impacts their brains. Kids who are hungry can't focus in school. They're more prone to irritability and violence. They are much more likely to get sick and have to skip school or show up at school and get other kids sick, hurting their education. And if they live in a food desert where money for food is low, so there is no market driver to sell healthy food, Carbs and shelf-stable products are all they eat, boosting obesity, diabetes, and other diseases, along with the lack of necessary nutrients to boost a healthy, rational brain. I was on food stamps for a few months of unemployment at the height of the recession, and we ate healthier than ever. We went to farmers markets getting fresh fruits and veggies that normally would have made us think twice about, because that money was only able to be spent on food and nothing else. It helped out local farmers, and we ate better than we even do now. While it seems counterintuitive, everyone getting food stamps would actually cost us less as taxpayers overall, as there's no middleman that normally comes with food stamps, plus the market is already heavily subsidized in favor of unhealthy foods. $147 billion is spent yearly on obesity-related disease alone. Split that money among every person in the country, and that translates to around $500 a year. $100 per person a month is the amount we all should be getting for food stamps, which is around double that. Plus, if everyone has them, there will be no market to sell them for drugs and money. That's not even including the cost of crime rates, wasted economic potential from poor education, and taxes to pay for prisons. Pay for it with a tax off unhealthy food or money that is used to currently subsidize these foods, and Americans will not only be healthier, but not wasting money. And your choice doesn't go away at all. In fact, your choice increases, as right now veggies are too expensive compared to other subsidized food. It would be cheaper if everyone got food stamps than the current model. Crime would be lower, people would be healthier, they wouldn't have to go to the hospital as much, and be way more productive at work. And lastly, housing. It currently costs local and state taxpayers $25,000 per homeless person per year to keep them homeless. They have to pay cops to keep an eye on them, jail them, or move them that they could be spending on investigating or stopping actual crimes. Taxpayers also have to pay emergency room visits for completely preventable diseases caused by exposure from homelessness. The homeless also can't get a job without an address and can't access many services that could get them out of poverty without one. It costs $10,000 to $15,000 on average to house a homeless person. That is more than half as much as a taxpayer pays to keep them homeless, and allows them to actually find a job because they have an address. It is now half the price to taxpayers to house people than to leave them homeless, and we are paying for it. This is the wonders of evolution of automation that Marx predicted, and the travesty of unbalanced capitalism. Just to provide free healthcare, education, food, and housing would, from Marx's 1800s viewpoint, be a communist utopia. It is this system that Stalin believed was just around the corner due to pseudoscience that starved the Soviet people in the millions, when it would have taken another century to get there. We would all have so much more and be better and mentally and physically healthier if propaganda didn't lock us into believing in the moral certainty of pure capitalism and the evils of any hint of socialism. The false narrative that taxation is unfair and the free markets lets us keep our money to spend as we like instead of the government stealing it from us to give us a monopoly of services. Yeah, you can keep your money, but you have to spend up to twice as much as if you just let the government handle it. Even in nations where these things are free, there's always a private option, so people often do have a choice if they want to spend a bit more for it. But since the public option is the most efficient and cheapest possible, the private company has to keep their prices way lower than in America to compete. And America already has an example of government efficiency that saves the people money. The post office. Until about 5 years ago, it was 100% self-sustaining, and no other postal service matched its efficiency and low cost. They drove down the cost of competing companies like UPS and FedEx, and people had choice. But UPS and FedEx lobbied and donated to politicians to pass laws to harm the post office, such as requiring them to have 70 years worth of retirement money on hand at all times, which no company ever has, along with blocking their ability to innovate. This has forced them to make cuts that have driven up prices, and therefore UPS and FedEx can raise their prices, costing us all more. The overall goal is to eliminate the post office or sell it off so that it has a profit motive, causing prices to spike even worse. In all reality, the internet and perhaps even cell towers should be considered a constitutionally mandated post road, as Jefferson considered the transfer of information essential to a democracy. The post office should expand into hardware, and companies could compete in the software. In most other nations where government is involved with the internet, it costs 1/10 what it costs in the US. This is because they are also involved in repairing roads and other infrastructure, and laying down fiber while doing maintenance costs a fraction of what it costs to lay fiber in the US. The post office should have been in charge of this, but instead, since Comcast is literally the most powerful lobbyist in DC, we get internet at 10 times the cost of the rest of the world, and 1/10, especially in rural regions, that can't afford high-speed internet, as there is no market motives to do so, and can't get the information they need to be responsible citizens, their kids can't do homework, and they can't be a part of the digital marketplace the rest of us take for granted. Because of automation destroying jobs, Bill Gates has recommended an automation tax to slow technology that we paid for in research through our tax monies from destroying jobs so people have time to get trained up for the next wave. Using that tax money to divide evenly as guaranteed basic income, or, if you don't like that, just a credit for housing and food. Another could be a carbon tax, and all that money was divided equally to offset the prices of fuel until we become carbon neutral, and renewables were the same price as fossil fuels, which are now much more subsidized than renewables. This is math, pure and simple. If you're voting against government providing through taxes and spending at all, out of some confused sense of fairness or ethics, of threat of violence, and not just being critical of individual problems with current government systems, you are voting to have to spend up to twice as much to live in a more crime-ridden, ignorant, unhealthy, unsafe, hopeless, and hungry nation. I, for one, would like to spend less, even if I have to spend it on taxes, to live in a smarter, safer, healthier, freer, and well-fed nation. The threat of violence of taking taxes is a trolley car problem where you have a choice to kill thousands yearly on the track and make millions suffer, or we can force everyone to toss their money into the tracks to stop it and save them. The threat of violence, which almost never happens, is way more ethical than the opposite, and their lives are better as well from reduced threat of violence of crime, poverty, disease, and hunger. Socialism at this point in history now has math on its side, as Marx predicted it would, as automation progressed. Stop fighting or enjoy paying twice as much for every basic need like we do now.
A big thank you goes out to Elias Garcia Guevara and Joe Taylor, who sponsor the show at $10 a month at the Wapawet level on Patreon. Please consider donating as well if you can, and thank you all for listening.